Hello and welcome to the latest Retire Well episode with me, Matthew, and as always I'm joined by Joe. Today we're going to think about retirement budgeting, and we're going to talk about common things we see from people who are approaching retirement, thinking about how much they'll need, and also some stories about how we've seen people's income change throughout retirement.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's obviously something that we speak a lot about with clients. We speak to a lot of clients that are coming up to retirement and they're looking at sort of phasing into retirement either sort of slowly or sort of a cliff edge retirement and going straight into being reliant on their pensions. And it's sometimes we speak to them and they go, well, I'm on this now, but as soon as I retire, I'm happy. I'm going to drop down to a lower amount, maybe spend 10%, 20% less or a few thousand less per year. And I think that's always quite an interesting one to think about, because a lot of people in sort of my experience actually maybe in the first few years of retirement start to spend a little bit more as they're doing the sort of things that they want to, the sort of key holidays or upgrades to car and that sort of thing. So today I think it would sort of be good to sort of chat through that, how you might want to sort of look at pulling together a retirement budget and maybe a few things that you can consider or change to make sure that you're not sort of outspending yourself and you're not going to be able to have that sort of long and happy retirement.
Yeah, I think what this comes down to is the hardest bit of being ready for retirement, which is knowing what do you need, and therefore, for what income do you want, but also what pensions and assets do you need to then provide that. So I think most commonly when you talk to people, as their wage goes up, they find that their expenditure goes up and they naturally just sort of leak a bit more money and spend a bit more money. Not always they know where it goes, but they find that, okay, lifestyle can change. And then the idea of coming back down or seeing what that might look like is actually a challenging process. Again, if someone's been on 50 grand or 100 grand a year, and then you say, okay, can you live on £24,000 or £30,000 a year? Again, there's almost a quick shock to the system of going, oof, that's half of what I'm on, or that's a lot less. And some of the things we're talking about with people are unpicking what will change. So again, the most common one someone says is, oh, well, currently, I can't choose, how much I spend on fuel because I'm driving to work, for example. So that's just something that's inevitable. And other people, for example, teachers go, oh, well, I can't go away any other time than the school holiday, so it costs me a fortune. So it's trying to unpick some of those bits in your own personal life, but equally, as you rightly identify, people have worked hard to get to retirement, so there's an element of the bucket list, and there's an element of what will that cost. So there's almost one-off extra costs, but there's also, well, what will life cost me in retirement?
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose that probably comes on quite nicely to the jargon buster. And I think for this is more so when you're actually speaking to professionals like ourselves and advisors, they'll bang on quite a lot about essential and discretionary and luxury expenditure. Whereas, I mean, I feel like most people just say, look, this is my spend in retirement or what I'm spending now. So breaking it down, essential, we see it as, I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory, but stuff that keeps the lights on, paying the mortgage, you could bring sort of standard food and weekly shopping to that as well. And then anything discretionary, I suppose this is stuff that could change in retirement, or if you didn't have enough income, you'd still be fine. You'd still sort of be able to do the basic things, but you may need to cut out some of the discretionary expenditure that might be holidays, socializing, other sort of leisure activities there.
Yeah, I think it's almost a jargon buster of what we think about in the industry, not necessarily what clients think about. Because you could say to someone, Sky Television might be a discretionary expenditure, but actually for them, they might say, well, that's an essential to who I am and what I want to do. So again, trying to unpick what is essential and what's discretionary. But from our point of view, what we're really trying to look at with people is, okay, if there's a financial crash or if someone's financial plan was really tested, what is the minimum that they would need to keep the lights on, keep the house heated, keep having food on the table? That is what I would say would be the essential bits. Then the holidays, the extra bits on cars, those sorts of bits could be the slightly more discretionary expenditure, where if you want to choose which supermarket you shop in or where you go on holiday, that's a little bit more of the luxury side of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And that actually probably brings us quite nicely on to the next piece that looks at a bit of research from retirement living standards. I mean, when I initially speak to clients, you either have people who know exactly how much they want in retirement, or they actually don't know, and they just know the things that they want to do in retirement and not necessarily how much that will cost yet. So retirement living standards, and I'll preface this is a very sort of broad view of retirement, and it's not saying that you need exactly this amount to retire and have those sort of that retirement that you want, but they break down into a couple of different things, sort of a minimum retirement, which is, I suppose, bare bones more towards that essential expenditure. And then they also look at a moderate and also a luxury retirement as well, where you can have a few more holidays, change the car sort of when you want and that sort of thing. But for a minimum level of retirement, they say that one person should need 13,500, a little bit under that actually, per annum. And for a couple, that increases to 21,600, sort of a minimum retirement. And for a moderate retirement, which sort of brings in more discretionary spend, more nights out, I suppose, more holidays, that sort of thing, that increases to 31,700 for one person and 43,900 for a couple, which there's a big sort of difference there between minimum and sort of a moderate retirement. I suppose that minimum one can pretty much just be covered from a state pension or something like that. And moderate, then obviously you need to bring in other income. What are your thoughts on that, Matthew, and how do you feel that sort of sets up as a broad brush?
I think it's a funny one, because I think some people look for science in an area where there isn't a science. So I've had people in the past who've gone, oh, I looked at those and I was thinking, that's really different to what I'm thinking about for my own retirement, or actually, I'm currently living on that minimum figure and I'm having a very comfortable retirement. So what am I missing? So I think what you rightly point out is what these figures are: generic, high-level figures as a broad brush to start people off with the thinking of which category broadly do you fall into. And it then essentially lets you think more about your own retirement plans and your own spending. I mean, I've got, people who live on 2 state pensions and have a very comfortable, very luxurious standard of living, but that's because they've done a lot of their upfront expenditure. So they've already, had some of the big holidays, they've already changed the car, they've already done home improvements and work on the garden. So they are really, every penny that they're getting in is being used. Whereas you can have other people who start retirement where, actually I might change the garden, or I might move house, or I might get a new kitchen. And quite quickly that extra cost obviously is very different to this ongoing bit. So I think it's really trying to use this as what is designed to be a starting point and a conversation piece. And then you can build your own bespoke plan. I mean, what I love, and I've talked about in the past, of people almost pretending they're retired when they're still working, almost moving an amount of money from one account to another to say, ignore my salary. This is how much I think I'm going to need to live on in retirement, and this is what I'm going to have coming in, move it across, and then see at the end of each month what the situation looks like. And I've had a client who's done that for a full year as they approach retirement, and then they felt so comfortable with the figures and what they'd budgeted for. Whereas the person who just goes, oh, I'm sure I'll be fine, when you get there, oh gosh, I hadn't thought about the car insurance, which I pay annually. I hadn't thought about a lodge fee for a caravan or something like that. Again, you can get lots of side swipes to a plan if you haven't really factored it in for the long term.
Yeah, and I suppose with these sort of general studies as well, they are nationwide studies at the end of the day. They don't really look at sort of regionalities within the UK. So that sort of 43,000 for a couple for a moderate retirement, it's going to be very different spend sort of in the south or the southeast compared to where we are in the northeast, and you could probably get a lot more for your money up here, even if you're looking at stuff like mortgage payments or sort of general day-to-day leisure spend. So
I was just going to say, I think it might be a funny thing for me to say, especially given our role, but I tend to say to people, don't worry too much about the exact pounds and pence, as long as you're in the right ballpark. So again, if someone's talking about taking a drawdown income in retirement of maybe £2,000 a month, if actually they find out they're really spending 2,200, that most likely there's going to be capacity in that plan for that extra money to be taken. The problem would be if it turns out they were actually taking 4,000, that's when, the previous model and the previous plan wouldn't have been worth the paper it was written on. And it would be very much a start again of what is your priority, what is your objectives, and can you really afford to spend this much money, or does something have to change? Which is when logically they would be looking at the discretionary element of that spending to squeeze that potentially.
Yeah, absolutely. And that comes quite nicely onto sort of why, although the budget to pounds and pence might not be sort of 100% exactly what you need, why budgeting does actually matter in retirement, because obviously you don't have that salary, you don't have that safety net of someone paying you an income each month, and you are essentially left with what you've built up over the last sort of 30, 35, 40 years that you might have worked for. And you're exposing yourself to those sort of longevity risks that are going to sort of take you through to sort of the end of your retirement, 30 plus years in some cases. And then depending on the structure of your retirement portfolio, you might be exposed to market risk, and that can impact it if you maybe have high withdrawals than you necessarily need.
Yeah, I think one of the most important things that you've said there is the idea of when someone's working, if they want more money, they can almost go, okay, I'll do some overtime, or I'll do some consulting, or I'll do something extra, or I'll look for a new job because, I want to have a higher salary. In retirement, that is the element of you've done all that work, you've done the hard work, you've got the pot. If you then need to increase your income, you have got flexibility, but it's only to a certain point. And I think that's the bit that's a very much the safety blanket of work, and I'll just work more or earn more, or even just work for a longer period of time. When that disappears, you want to be confident in your assessment of your needs, so that you're not going, oh, actually, I've really misunderstood this, and I'm going to have to go back to work, or I'm going to have to cut my cloth accordingly and really reduce expenditure.
So you've just spoke there a little bit about sort of potentially needing to reduce your expenditure through retirement, or maybe even sort of getting a job to help facilitate some of the income which you've lost out on if you don't get the budgets right. So I thought it'd be good to just chat through a few things where maybe clients don't always pick on them in the first instance when creating a retirement budget, about where your spend might actually be more than you expect it to be. I mean, the first one I suppose is relatively obvious in that sort of you're going to go away, you're going to look at sort of doing the things that you were wanting to do, and that might be in contrast to sort of your normal retirement expenditure. So when you're first looking at sort of your plan, you might say, oh, well, I only need 25,000 a year. That's going to be achieved by a state pension. I only need to top it up by half to get there.
Yeah.
But a lot of people I find in sort of at least immediate retirement do like to spend a bit more, as you've said, to sort of get stuff in the house in order, do those holidays that they've been waiting to do. But that might sort of increase your expenditure in those first years, which again, equally might reduce the longevity of your pot in retirement.
Yeah, I think it's that balance, isn't it? I think it's about being the sort of person or looks at the finances, thinks about it, and sees how things change. Again, I've had some clients who have been with the same mortgage provider for 10, 15 years. And then when you say, oh, are you on a fixed deal? Oh, I'm not sure. Again, for that person, you inevitably know that there's a more competitive deal out there, and they need to be slightly more proactive with their finances. And I think the same thing applies with, with lifestyle creep throughout retirement. Again, the classic one of going, if you're with Sky and your TV's on a deal, you might have a really competitive price. In 18 months' time, you might have a very uncompetitive price where you're either looking to get a deal again or move to someone else. And if you don't do that, you've accidentally seen your expenditure sort of balloon. And if that's just one line on the expenditure, if you exacerbate that across, you can accidentally have the thing where subscriptions and regular bits almost just runs away with itself slightly.
Yeah, and I think with that as well, we're not saying that doing those things in sort of that immediate period after retirement is wrong. In fact, we encourage it a lot of the time to front load retirement. But if you get used to spending that, or used to continuing spending like you were when you were salaried or earning money, that's when potentially might go, instead of that 3-year higher spend, you might go, well, actually, let's keep this going. We're quite enjoying this.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is the bit that might be a little bit more dangerous. But outside of that, there's the other sort of general things that might not be factored into a retirement budget. Stuff like helping family. Matthew, do you want to sort of just run through that? Maybe a couple of experiences you've had with clients there? that?
Yeah, of course. I think again, it's the unknown or the known bits, but you don't quite know when it's going to happen. So again, most people, when you say to them, okay, you're in an affluent position, you're doing well, you're ready to retire, do you see a time when you'll want to make gifts to your family members or provide them with a deposit for university or a house, for example? Most people say, oh yes, that sounds good, but do they know when? Do they know how much? And those are the bits that, sometimes you have people where, we know that Bank of Mum and Dad is one of the highest lenders in the UK. And you can have people coming and essentially saying, okay, we've seen a dream house, Mum and Dad. Can we borrow some money? And again, it might come earlier than they were expecting, or it might be for a higher amount. So again, it's almost trying to balance those unknown bits to say, have we got a buffer and have we got capacity to be able to do that when's required? I had a client recently who their son was going through a quite nasty divorce, and they said, okay, we were in our retirement home. We were in a position that we thought we were going to live in for the next 20, 30 years, and it was going to be the two of us. They actually had the son move in and a couple of the grandchildren. Again, their life changed quite a bit, but equally their expenditure changed quite a bit because they were feeding more mouths. They had more, bills, electricity being used, the washing machine on. So again, it's that element of factoring in the automatic things that people would do, such as help your son and help your family, but also then think about, okay, do we need to turn up a flexible income tap? And is that okay? Are we borrowing from later life me when I don't think I'll need to spend as much in my 80s and spend more in my 60s? Or am I actively starting to say, I'm trying to reduce the money in my name, for example, for inheritance tax planning?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the other sort of one this is definitely one that can't really be planned for. It's the health costs and care fee aspect. We have spoke a little bit about it in the past, and about how we're quite fortunate in the UK that you will have some form of care when you do potentially get to that stage in life. But some people do want to look at not just the local authority, most basic care that you can get, and some people do want to look at that sort of higher level of potentially private care and a nicer home to be in. And I think that needs to, if you're looking at that and you're wanting that, it does need to be planned for and potentially look at sort of how that might fit into the overarching plan.
Yeah, I've had a few clients who say, I'm going to need a hip replacement, I'm going to need a knee replacement, and the NHS waiting list is too long for me to wait if I really need it. So they've built into their cash flow models and their plans to say, can I have £16,000 this year because I might need a hip or I might need a knee, and if I don't, well, at least then it's in the plan that if it rolls over a year, it gives me the flexibility to spend it on something else if required. So that's where cash flow modeling is really useful, but you don't know what's going to come out as an extra on top of it. So again, someone going, actually, I don't want to not be able to walk for 6 months, so I'm going to say, okay, a private knee adds a lot of value to me. Again, we often have people come to us and say, one of the big things I need in retirement is to plan for, later life care. Well, what are we planning for? Because we don't know if they're going to end up in a care home. We don't know how much it's going to cost for live-in care, or even if they'll need care at all. But really what they're saying is, have I got enough that I can choose the care I want? But equally, have I not got too much that there's going to be too much loss to the local authority or too much loss to taxation with inheritance tax? So it's that balance of flexibility to choose versus not having too much that you're going to be disadvantaged, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that is an interesting one. Most clients that I speak to are more on the let's not give something away to the local authority.
100%.
And therefore they're wanting to minimise the assets that they have while still being able to maximise the retirement. But like you say, there are some people that do want to have something there to push into the other side of things. And I think it's probably easier to plan for not having enough assets and sort of reducing it below the local authority as opposed to having enough, because care is very much an unknown and you don't know how long it's going to be.
I think I often frame it to people when they say, oh, well, I don't want to have to pay for my care because, I don't want to lose money, or the family doesn't want to lose money. I often frame that the other way and say, it is that choice that if you were allocated to the worst care home and, you felt like your care was awful, if you didn't have the flexibility of funds to then upgrade and choose the level of care you wanted, that would be a very sad state of affairs to be in, having been at this point with a good amount of money in pensions or a good amount of money in assets. So I think there's a balance, but it's that, it's the priority of, people emotionally think, oh, I don't want to pay tax, or emotionally say, I don't want to give money to the local authority. But actually, if you spun that the other way and said, do you want to have the worst level of care available, or would you like the flexibility to perhaps choose, carers to come into your house for a few years to try and help you through that period? There could be some actually strong arguments the other way.
Yeah. So moving on to looking at sort of, I suppose, tools and approaches to budgeting and how do you get that budget right? We've talked about how sometimes it might go wrong. You mentioned also just there about cash flow planning. I think it's brilliant. I think it's a great bit of financial advice and something that everyone should really look at. We've mentioned in previous podcasts, or I have, where it will be wrong. It's not sort of 100% predictive, but I think it really does help visualize those potential scenarios. And particularly if you are looking at it, don't look at the sort of best case scenario that you're going to get 5 or 10% return on your investments for the next 20 years and you're never going to overspend, because I don't think that's very useful at all. I think cash flow planning really is best when you look at stress testing it. If you look at, as Matthew said there, maybe planning a hip or a knee replacement in sort of 5 years time or 10 years time, maybe look at sort of bringing in those sort of not regular purchases like cars being replaced every 3 years. That's something that people also don't always think about. Maybe look at sort of inflation being a little bit higher or investment performance being a little bit lower, and that can really sort of help sort of pull at your retirement plan and see if there is any holes. Yeah,
what I tend to say to my mum, for example, is what's happened to the current account on a monthly basis. If at the end of 1 month, it's very much the same as the last month, broadly speaking, your budgeting's right, your income and expenditure's right, move on to the next month. Again, if it suddenly gets to a month and you've seen that, go up quite a lot or drop quite a lot, something's changed. And is that in line with your long-term plan, or was it an unknown cost? Did the car need a lot of work that you weren't expecting? So has that come from your almost miscellaneous pot? So I think cash flow modeling is perfect for setting those. I know what income I've got coming in, and I think I know what I'm going to spend. So this is where I expect to be. And then there's the real life element of it, of to say, okay, has my current account dwindled? Has my cash buffer gone up or down? And I've had people who've, entered retirement with a high cash buffer, say £100,000. A year later, if that's £112,000, actually, did they need that buffer? Maybe they did psychologically, but from a financial point of view, they can probably allocate that to the medium or the long-term pot. But actually, they may choose to say, I don't know if that's been a normal year, so let's roll it on again. If that's then 98,000 the next year, okay, broadly speaking, we haven't need to spend the money. If it's still 112, actually, let's make this money work harder for us. So I think that's where cash flow planning is an art, not a science, but it's really that element of the more you think about it and the more you anticipate what you're going to spend money on, the more confident you are with your spending, and then therefore the clearer your strategy is. And I think that's the really clear bit, rather than just saying it's going to be, £2,500 a month. You go and actually, it looks like last year we spent this, and it looks like this year we're spending that. Plus we've got a big holiday or something coming up. So let's manage that. And therefore, when you look in the rearview mirror, you probably see a more accurate reflection of what you projected.
Yeah, and when you're looking at the cash flow and you are sort of now more understanding exactly what you are spending on a month-to-month basis, I think that's when you can quite nicely break it down into that sort of essential and discretionary spend that we spoke about at the start. And although, mental accounting is where you sort of try and take a different bit of a view on something that you hold compared to another part, for example, cash versus pensions. Mm-hmm. But I think that can actually work to your favour in almost segmenting some of your income into different products or investments. One thing I would think works quite well, once you understand what that essential expenditure is, and maybe essential plus one, so still enjoying sort of the sort of bits, not just rice and beans and keeping the lights on. You could sort of look at purchasing an annuity or something. If you don't have a DB pension or your state pension is maybe not in payment yet, an annuity could cover that sort of essential spend, make sure that you really are, you've got that income to not overspend essentially and start reducing down on your drawdown pot. And then any of the discretionary or luxury expenditure or big holidays, car purchases can come from that flexible income, be it ISAs or pensions. And I think that can sometimes be a nicer way of, and again, that more comes back to the psychology of let's maybe take a bit more risk with the discretionary pot as opposed to the essentials, which we really need to keep us going through retirement.
Yeah, I think it's really, as you describe, it's that active looking in. You're not accidentally spending, or you're not sort of going through just on a sort of autopilot approach. I think that's what really adds a lot of value. And I think also if something large happens in your life, having a sit down to really work out what that looks like. Again, your classic one being a bereavement or an inheritance, that could be a big, significant moment in your life. One, it could be actually, I used to have, 2 state pensions and now we only have 1, or it might be, okay, I've now got a lump sum of money, which actually means I can spend more. And where do I want to spend more? Which essentials, do I add on to increase that discretionary bit? And I think that's the flexibility of a good financial plan, is to say, it works on the long term of the plan, but we can adjust it for this, we can adjust it for that. We can almost work with changing objectives as well as changing health and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and just reiterating something that you said earlier, which I do think is a great tool and approach to, especially when you're starting to go into retirement. If you are employed and you do have some savings, I do think it's brilliant if you can almost forget about the income that you're being paid and use those savings to almost live off. And it could be that you put those excess income from your salary into a pension. And again, that builds up your retirement. But I think that's a really good way of, although you're not strictly phasing into retirement yet, you might still be working, but getting you in that mind space of spending your own money as opposed to someone else's money.
Yeah, 100%.
Okay. So I suppose overarching on this sort of topic today, it's very much sort of balancing today, making sure that you're sort of getting everything that you want out of your retirement, because retirement is for enjoyment. You've worked hard for 30, 40 years versus how it might impact tomorrow. Yeah. So I think it is about that sort of important flexibility. But as Matthew said, just being sort of mindful of what you are spending and making sure that you're tracking it, because you don't want to sort of get out of kilter and really knock on, have an adverse effect on future retirement.
Yeah, I think there's definitely times that I can remember where clients have gone, oh, well, I'm going to spend less when I'm older. And they've used that as the excuse to probably spend a bit too much in the early years. And I think that's completely fine. You can borrow from your later life, but you also go in, I still need money in that chapter. So it's trying to get the balance between it. We equally have other clients who we think don't spend enough to start with, and therefore they've always got capacity and they're always not quite spending what they could. And therefore it's like, well, actually you're then saying to them, what do you want to do with these extra funds? What is the plan? But I think that's really the balance of trying to, we've talked about it in the past. Do you want to pass away with £1 to your name, or do you want to pass away with £500,000 to your name? Well, ideally, you'd probably do neither, and you'd be somewhere in the middle. You'd have gifted, you'd have had funds, but you don't want to be saying, okay, I want my last check to bounce, because we don't know when we're going to write our last check. So I think that's the real perfect bit about flexibility, trying to work through it with a dynamic plan. And people who do spend more in the early years of retirement and spend less when they get older, yes, that's very common, but don't just use that as the excuse to maybe overspend initially.
Yeah. And then rounding off the episode with a listener's question, as always, this one's very much related to, I suppose, those almost unknown lump sum spends that can come up. And it's a question that I get quite a lot with regards to more particularly the tuition fee side of things. But if you're a parent or grandparent and you want to sort of look at helping children with tuition fees and university fees, how best do you do that? How do you plan for that? And how do you sort of work it into the long-term plan?
Yeah, so to change the question slightly, one of the common questions I get is should our son or daughter, should they get the loan from university? We're going to give them some money, so should they not get the loan and we'll just give them the money instead? When we look at that one, because it's almost doesn't really count as real debt, so logically, because there's certain caveats of when it gets paid back, often the answer there is, okay, get the maximum loan that you can, and then it's what the individual does with it. So that's the important thing. Again, if someone is in a strong financial position and they have got a grandparent or a parent who are going to give them some money, they could almost say, okay, well, actually, I'm going to invest some of my student loan for the long term, and then that's going to be a pot for a house deposit. Plus, if I actually needed to pay it off, maybe grandparents or parents would help in that side of things as well. So that's looking at it from the other way. But when you think about it from the parent's point of view, it's really saying, do you have a specific date that you want to give some money, or is it a case that you want to just build up a pot that has the flexibility to be gifted? We typically say to people, okay, well, do you want to have the growth on that pot in your name, where you're potentially paying tax on it, or do you want to put it into the individual who you're gifting it to name, maybe in something like an ISA? Again, the typical pushback there is to say, what does their wider finances look like? What's their health conditions? Have they got anything that's going to, they're going to need benefits in the future, or anything there that having a lump sum of money in their name might stop? But typically, if they are good with finances, or they're willing to leave some money invested for a house deposit, or to pay off university fees, doing things like ISAs for them, or putting money in a bank account that's for a special occasion, that comes with those sort of the good habits and the financial education piece.
Yeah, and I think the house deposit versus tuition fees is that common question of which one's right. I mean, as you said, given that a student loan isn't always seen as proper debt, yes, you will pay it back over the course of your life, but it's forgiven after 30 and the new loan's 40 years. I think, personally, that sort of step up onto the housing ladder is one of the biggest bits that sort of younger people struggle with. So leaning towards that might get more out of it. But I don't know. I think it's an interesting one. It all comes down to sort of personal. Ask the children as well is something that you might want to do of which one they want. But equally, then they might go spend it elsewhere. I
think, to flip it the other way, it's an element of, would you want to leave your money on death, in the old-fashioned traditional way, or do you want to try and help someone in your lifetime and their lifetime? Again, bringing those gifts forward can have a lot more impact and can be really useful, but you've also got that sort of other side of things where you go, but what if we don't have enough? Do I want to have gifted £20,000 towards a house deposit here, and then actually in 10 years' time, I haven't got enough in my retirement plan to keep going with the discretionary and the essential spending I want? That's the caveat of almost what is the top objective. Is it the gift, or is it the security of income? For me, you've always got to say pensions and retirement planning is to provide you as the individual or as the couple the income. If it can then be used for a gift or a house purchase or tuition fees, brilliant. But let's not forget the primary objective is the individual who's worked hard and built up that pot.
Absolutely. I think that rounds off the episode really well, all about sort of your goals and objectives and sort of making sure you look after yourself first, and then if we do have access, we can...
Make sure you put your own life mask on before helping others. That's that sort of message that, again, if you're accidentally trying to help someone else and you forget to help your own finances.
Absolutely. Okay. Thank you very much for watching. As always, feel free to sort of leave comments and ask any questions in the comments below. We'll be back again next week for another episode. Thank you very much.